El último secreto de un jardinero florece bajo la tierra. ¿Descubrirá Miss Marple la verdad? Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos. Soy su anfitrión, Juan. Díganme, ¿desde qué parte del mundo nos sintonizan esta noche? Siempre me encanta leer tus comentarios. Significa mucho tenerte aquí. Comencemos. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos. Soy su anfitrión Andrés. ¿Desde dónde nos sintonizas? Deja un comentario y únete al misterio. Tus historias hacen que este viaje sea inolvidable. Comencemos. It was the sort of afternoon that made one grateful for a comfortable chair, a pot of assam, and the distant hum of bees. The hedges of old Vicarage Lane had just been trimmed, the roses in full July bloom, and the air in the village of Fernley Cross smelled faintly of lavender, grass cuttings, and honeysuckle. It was, as Miss Marple remarked to herself, precisely the kind of day on which nothing dreadful ought to happen. The village had gathered, as it often did, in the garden of Mrs. Rosalind Everleigh, widow of a naval captain and owner of Fernley Manor. The occasion was no more than a midsummer tea, to celebrate the restoration of the old greenhouse and the retirement of its long-standing gardener, Mr. Lionel Craig. Tables were laid out under the wisteria, with silver trays of buttered scones, finger sandwiches, and the lemon drizzle cake for which Mrs. Everleigh's cook was rightly famed. Miss Marple, seated quietly under the shade of a yew tree, held a delicate china cup and listened, though she appeared only to be observing the sparrows. Her pale blue eyes, sharper than the shears in the gardener's shed, darted gently from speaker to speaker. Mrs. Bantry was recounting the time a fox had gotten into her chicken coop. Young Archie Tomlinson, the village solicitor's son, was boasting about his new Triumph motorcycle. Reverend Biddle was murmuring about the upcoming church roof appeal. But it was the gardener, Mr. Craig, who seemed slightly out of step with the scene, a wiry man of 70, with a back too straight and eyes too wary. He stood stiffly near the trellis, only nodding when spoken to. He had always been a silent man, disciplined, solitary, but today there was something else. Something almost fretful. Twice he had turned his gaze toward the shaded corner behind the greenhouse, where the wild rhododendrons grow unchecked. "Of course," said Mrs. Everleigh, cutting her lemon cake with unnecessary force. "Lionel's worked here longer than Henry ever lived. 40 years. Imagine that. He knew every root and every stone on this land. Why, he even buried poor Marmalade under the rosebush himself, our old spaniel. You remember him, Jane?" Miss Marple nodded with a soft smile. "Indeed, I recall him. Being rather fond of Eccles cakes, he used to nudge my handbag whenever I visited." The laughter that followed was gentle, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She had noticed, some 10 minutes earlier, that Mr. Craig had not touched a single item on his farewell table, neither cake nor tea. And when young Dotty Kendrick had tried to hand him a card signed by all the villagers, he had merely stared at it, then turned away. It was later, just before the guests were about to depart, that the first ripple passed through the garden party like a sudden wind. "Mr. Craig!" came the cry from Clara Hadwell, the vicar's niece. He had fallen just behind the greenhouse. Some said he had merely tripped over a root. Others claimed they saw his hand clutch at his chest. But as several rushed forward, Reverend Biddle, Archie, and even stout Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple stayed, rooted by the yew tree, watching, not the body, not the alarmed faces, but something else entirely. For just a moment, in the commotion, a figure had stepped quietly back from the greenhouse door. A woman, dark skirt, pressed white blouse, an unfamiliar face. She did not run. She did not gasp. She simply turned and walked toward the back of the garden, past the roses, past the ferns, and vanished. Call the doctor. Someone was shouting. Fetch Dr. Lowell. I believe, said Miss Marple softly, placing her cup on its saucer with care, that Lionel Craig is beyond Dr. Lowell's help. The guests murmured in shock as the truth was confirmed. The old gardener was dead. By evening, the manor was hushed, cordoned by a discreet circle of constables under Sergeant Weatherby's direction. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage on Church Lane, but left her teacup unwashed, her knitting untouched in her lap. For all the commotion and village gossip that would ensue, she already knew something others did not. A man like Lionel Craig does not collapse by coincidence, not on the day of his retirement, not while glancing furtively toward the greenhouse, and most certainly not after whispering the word testament just moments before his collapse. By the following morning, the death of Mr. Lionel Craig had rippled through Fernley Cross like a stone dropped into Still Pond, water first gentle, then widening, overlapping with speculation and suspicion. At the post office, Mrs. Marjorie Copley was already recounting the scene for the third time that hour, each version of her tale subtly changing. He just clutched his chest. Poor man. Collapsed like a felled birch tree. I said to Muriel only last week that he didn't look well, didn't I, Muriel? Muriel, who worked the telegram counter and rarely spoke unless spoken to, gave a vague nod. At the grocer's, old Mr. Henley whispered to Mrs. Bantry that the vicar's niece had seen Craig arguing with someone behind the greenhouse before he died. A woman, I hear, he said, in a tone that was half scandal, half satisfaction. Not from the village, mind you, stranger. That never bodes well. By noon, the entire village was humming with theories. He was old. It was the strain. He'd been nervous, didn't you think? The twitch in the eye. I heard he left something behind. A letter. Maybe a will. Miss Marple, who had just returned from the florist with a bundle of sweet peas in hand, stopped briefly outside the bakery where two schoolteachers were debating whether Lionel Craig had once been married in secret. Never a wife in sight. Not in 40 years, one of them said with certainty. Though I always suspected that something happened during the war. You remember those years he wouldn't speak of. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely pressed the sweet peas tighter against her cardigan and walked back toward Church Lane. Inside her cottage, the drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender, furniture, polish, and rose jam. A fire crackled low in the hearth, despite the warmth of the day. She sat, placed the flowers into a tall glass jar, and looked thoughtfully toward the window, where the hedges rolled out like a green tide into the hills. She had spoken to Mr. Craig perhaps a dozen times over the years. Not much by village standards, and certainly not enough to claim friendship. But she had watched him, observed his silence at fetes, his rigid politeness at church, his habit of keeping to the corners rather than the center of things. He had always been deferential, always precise. And yet yesterday she had seen something quite different in his face, an unease bordering on fear. Sergeant Weatherby, summoned from nearby Milchester, had done his best to keep the tone somber yet efficient. At 45, Weatherby had the good sense to know when to follow rules and when to defer to instincts. He had, over the years, come to treat Miss Marple with a kind of bemused respect, though he rarely admitted it aloud. It's likely natural causes, he'd said, at the scene, standing by the greenhouse. But we'll wait on Dr. Lowell to confirm. Still, I can't deny it's a bit of an odd time to go, isn't it? All these people about, garden party and all. Miss Marple had nodded. People often die at inconvenient moments, Sergeant, but not usually with such disquiet in their expression. He'd looked at her sideways then. You think there's something to it? I think, she replied gently, that the dead often leave behind unfinished business, and the living are not always eager to see it finished. Meanwhile, the official word that came back from Dr. Lowell late that afternoon was heart failure, consistent with stress, elevated age, and long years of physical work. But the doctor had also mentioned something else in a low voice to Weatherby, which Miss Marple caught only in fragments as they stood by the gate. Traces of something unusual in the lungs, not enough to confirm perhaps a stimulant. Though not a modern one could be plant-based. I'll send it off for further analysis. The sergeant looked thoughtful but not alarmed. Miss Marple, however, tilted her head slightly and murmured, "Even nature has its poisons. Sergeant Foxglove grows not far from Fernley Manor, I believe." By the next morning, the villagers' grief had transformed into a cautious curiosity. Mrs. Everleigh, ever the embodiment of dignity, had ordered the greenhouse locked and instructed her housemaid to cancel that week's flower orders. Out of respect, she said, though privately she was more concerned about potential scandal. And scandal, indeed, seemed to stir beneath the surface. That evening, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It had no return address, only her name written in an unfamiliar, spidery hand. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single line on thin, aged paper. "Ask about the tree stump behind the potting bench. He buried something there." Miss Marple read it once, then again. There was no signature, no indication of who might have written it. But the mention of a stump behind the potting bench, so specific, so seemingly mundane, made her eyes narrow ever so slightly. She tucked the letter between the pages of The Poisonous Garden Plants of Great Britain, a book she kept on her shelf, not out of morbid interest, but because, as she often said, one never knows what one might encounter in a village garden. That evening, as twilight painted the hedgerows mauve and violet, a strange quiet settled over Fernley Cross. Somewhere near the rectory, an owl called. At the manor, the greenhouse stood shuttered, a single pane of glass cracked by what seemed an errant branch. Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her knitting resting on her lap, the fire dimming to embers. She did not yet know who had written the letter, nor what Mr. Craig had feared. But she did know one thing with certainty: gardens, like people, often hid their secrets beneath the surface. And tomorrow she would pay a quiet visit to Fernley Manor, not as a detective, but as a concerned friend who, perhaps, had a soft spot for greenhouses and an old man's last whisper. The following morning dawned soft and overcast, the kind of gentle grey sky that made the garden paths damp underfoot and turned every hedge into a deeper shade of green. Miss Marple, dressed in her pale lilac cardigan and a straw hat with a small blue ribbon, set out from her cottage with purpose. In one gloved hand, she carried a small basket containing gooseberry jam for Mrs. Everleigh excuse, of course, for what she truly intended to do. The gates of Fernley Manor stood slightly ajar, their black iron hinges creaking as she pushed through. A housemaid with anxious eyes let her in with only a small nod. Everyone in the village knew Miss Marple, and more importantly, no one ever suspected her of anything beyond a kind-hearted curiosity. Mrs. Everleigh received her in the morning room, a bright space with French windows opening toward the greenhouse. She looked unusually pale, her movements precise but strained. On a small table beside her sat a silver tray with a fresh teapot and 2 cups. "Oh, Jane, how thoughtful. Do sit down, Jam. That's lovely of you. It's been, well, quite an ordeal." Miss Marple lowered herself into a cushioned chair, setting the basket down beside her. "I thought you might not feel much like shopping this week. I do hope the police haven't troubled you too much." Mrs. Everleigh gave a thin smile. "They've been very polite. Really, Sergeant Weatherby asked a few questions, routine. He said he doesn't seem to think there was anything suspicious. Miss Marple stirred her tea quietly. And you? Do you think there was anything suspicious? There was a pause. The sort of pause that, in a different sort of conversation, might have been filled with cream cakes or a weather remark. But here it lingered, like steam over tepid tea. I don't know what to think, Mrs. Everleigh said finally. Lionel was unusual, loyal to a fault, but secretive in ways I never questioned. He once told me the garden was a sanctuary from people, not a way to get closer to them. Still, it was odd the way he looked at the greenhouse before it happened, as if he expected something or someone. Miss Marple nodded gently. May I take a little stroll through the garden before I go? It's always been a lovely one, and I think best near roses. Mrs. Everleigh hesitated only for a moment. Of course, Jane. You're always welcome. But the greenhouse is still locked, I'm afraid. Police orders. That's quite all right, Miss Marple said, rising with her cup. It's not always the inside of a place that tells you what's important. Sometimes it's the things around the edges. She left by the side door, her shoes whispering against the damp flagstones, and passed quietly through the rose arches and down toward the greenhouse. A police ribbon still fluttered near the door handle, but no constables were in sight. Miss Marple made a slow circle round the building, noting the cracks in the glass, the footprints in the soil that had since begun to blur with dew. She paused near the back, where the rhododendrons grow thick and untamed. There, just as the letter had said, was the potting bench-hold, moss-flecked, its underside obscured by wooden trays and tangled roots, and beyond it, tucked in the far corner of the greenhouse wall, a tree stump, worn and partly decayed, but clearly visible. Kneeling with more ease than one might expect from someone of her age, Miss Marple gently moved a layer of dry leaves. At the base of the stump, half concealed by soil, was something hard. She pulled it free slowly, a small, rusted tin box, once painted green but now faded to a dull brown. It bore no markings. She held her breath as she opened it. Inside were several yellowed sheets of paper, folded with care. One appeared to be a handwritten letter, another a diagram, perhaps of the garden, though worn by moisture and smudged with soil. At the very bottom, a pressed flower nightshade. Miss Marple stood, eyes narrowed. There was no signature on the letter, only a name scrawled at the bottom, for Ruth, in case they come before I can speak. She closed the tin box and hid it inside her basket beneath the gingham cloth. Then she walked slowly back toward the house, pausing only once to examine the wild rhododendrons again. Back in her cottage, she laid the papers out to dry on her dining table and studied them with growing clarity. The map showed a series of paths within the garden, but altered, as if secret tracks once existed behind the flower beds. The letter was fragmentary and vague, but certain lines stood out. Buried it when the war ended, could not trust the Everleigh boy watching the garden now. Though I saw her again near the ferns, if Ruth returns, she'll know where to look. Who was Ruth? And who was the woman Mr. Craig thought he saw? A stranger, or someone with reason to remain hidden? Later that afternoon, Sergeant Weatherby came calling, his hat in hand. "I've had a report, Miss Marple," he said, a bit flustered. "Someone saw you near the greenhouse this morning." She looked at him with calm eyes. "Oh yes, I visited Mrs. Everleigh, took her some jam. She kindly let me stroll in the garden. It's a lovely spot for reflection." He shifted uncomfortably. "You didn't see anyone else, or touch anything?" "Just a few rose petals, Sergeant, but you might want to look into something else." She handed him a list she had jotted down. Fernley Manor's gardeners through the last 50 years. she explained. "You'll find that only one name stands out with any gaps. Lionel Craig, from 1949, but there's no record of who tended the garden during the war. A rather curious absence, wouldn't you say?" Weatherby looked at the paper, then at her. "You think this is about something older?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that this is not just a case of sudden death. It may be a case of buried truths, and someone, Sergeant, is very nervous that those truths might soon come to light." As the day faded into twilight once more, the pressed nightshade flower rested on her mantelpiece. Poisonous, yes, but only if used with knowledge and intent. And someone in Fernley Cross, it seemed, had both. It was the following day when the village's speculative buzz narrowed its focus to something more pointed: a suspect. Not everyone in Fernley Cross believed in foul play, but those who did were beginning to lean, as villagers often do, toward the simplest solution. It was a natural instinct, Miss Marple often reflected, to seize upon a name that fit a pattern, even if the pattern itself had been poorly stitched. That name, whispered in the corners of shops and passed between sips of morning tea, was Delilah Bray. Delilah had come to Fernley Cross only a year ago, renting the ivy-draped lodge at the far end of the Everley estate, the gardener's lodge, some still called it, though no one had lived there since the early 50s. A woman in her late 30s, she was neither exactly friendly nor standoffish. She kept to herself, worked odd hours in her conservatory, and often took long walks through the wilder paths of the gardens. But it was her presence at the garden party and, more precisely, her quiet disappearance just after Mr. Craig collapsed, that placed her firmly in the line of scrutiny. "I saw her," whispered Mrs. Bantry to Mrs. Copley as they passed the milliner's shop, "behind the greenhouse, walked off like it was nothing. Didn't even look surprised. Odd, that, and she's not even from here," Mrs. Copley added, as if that sealed the matter. Could be anything, really divorced, or worse. At the same time, Sergeant Weatherby was making a visit to Miss Bray's lodge. He arrived just after breakfast, his steps crunching on the gravel path as he approached the vine-wrapped front porch. She answered the door in a linen robe, her dark hair tied back, eyes alert. "Yes," she said, her tone calm but guarded. "Miss Bray, I'm following up on the unfortunate death of Mr. Craig," Weatherby began. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. The interior of the lodge was clean, simply decorated. Stacks of books, mostly botany and natural sciences, lined the walls. A pressed flower display hung above the fireplace, neatly labeled, including nightshade, foxglove, and yew. "You were at the garden party," he said, settling into a chair. "Several witnesses say they saw you near the greenhouse. I walked past it," she said. "It was crowded elsewhere, and I prefer quiet corners. You left before the others." "Why?" "I don't like crowds, or death. When people rushed toward him, I assumed there was nothing I could do." She folded her arms. "I'm not a doctor, and I don't enjoy becoming a topic of gossip." Weatherby regarded her a moment longer. "Mind if I ask, what brought you to Fernley Cross?" She paused. "I was looking for a place with history, somewhere private. The lodge had been empty for decades. It suited me and your work. I'm a botanical illustrator. I catalogue rare plants. My studio's in the back." Weatherby glanced toward the rear door. "Would you mind if I had a quick look?" Delilah hesitated, then gave a short nod. The studio was sunlit, orderly. Pressed flowers in various stages of preservation rested on tables beside delicate ink sketches. There was nothing obviously incriminating, but also nothing entirely comforting. Later that day, Miss Marple met the sergeant near the churchyard gate. "You spoke with Miss Bray?" she asked. "I did," Weatherby replied. She was polite, calm, maybe. Doesn't have an alibi for the moment Craig died, but nothing conclusive. Bit odd, though. Her studio's full of toxic plants, and she admitted to walking near the greenhouse. I'd say she bears watching. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Yes, perhaps, but calmness is not always concealment, Sergeant, and being near something is not the same as touching it. He studied her face. You don't think she did it? I think, she said gently, that Miss Bray may be exactly what she claims to be. A woman who prefers quiet over spectacle. And quiet women often see things others miss. That afternoon brought another name into the mix, Mr. Edward Everley, Rosalind's son. A tall, nervous man in his early 50s, Edward had lived in London most of his adult life, working in antiques and rarely visiting Fernley Cross. But he had arrived unexpectedly the night before the garden party. And though his presence was explained away as a short visit, Miss Marple noted that he seemed oddly restless. He was seen pacing the rose path late that same evening, and to villagers, young Mr. Peverell and his sister claimed they'd heard him raise his voice in an argument near the greenhouse, though they hadn't seen whom he was speaking to. When asked by Sergeant Weatherby about the timing of his visit, Edward simply said he missed the countryside. But Miss Marple knew that Edward Everley had always been distant toward Fernley Manor, more an inheritance than a home. More curiously, when she encountered him in the village square, he'd offered her a quick nod, then turned away before she could comment on the weather. And Edward, unlike his mother, had always been obsessively polite. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat once again in her drawing-room, rereading the letter found beneath the stump. Could not trust the Everley boy, it said, boy, not man, but the implication was clear enough. Lionel Craig, for all his quiet ways, had trusted few, and Edward Everley had apparently been among those excluded from that circle. Two names, to people with presence near the greenhouse, one with a motive unclear, the other with family ties that might conceal secrets. Yet something still itched in the back of Miss Marple's mind, something about the pressed flower nightshade. Why that particular specimen? She retrieved the small tin again and turned the folded map over. Faint, almost erased, was a scrawl on the reverse. The one who knows the plants, she may be the last to see it, right. The one who knows the plants, that could point to Delilah Bray, but it could also have meant Lionel himself, or someone else entirely. And then, another thought struck her. Ruth, the name on the letter. Whoever she was, she might hold the key to untangling what Craig had tried to preserve or protect. Miss Marple reached for her telephone and slowly dialed the number for St. Agnes Registry, the local archive office. I wonder, she said calmly to the clerk who answered, if you might look up something for me. I'm curious about the ownership history of the Gardener's Lodge on the Everley estate, particularly if the name Ruth appears anywhere in the records. She replaced the receiver, smoothed her lap, and looked out toward the night, falling gently over the hedges of Church Lane. Somewhere in Fernley Cross, someone had killed a man. And like the roots of a stubborn weed, the motive remained hidden. Just below the surface, waiting for Miss Marple to dig a little deeper. It was nearly midday when the post arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, on Church Lane, carried, as usual, by young Peter Triggs, who always delivered it with a cheery knock and the smell of bicycle grease clinging to his cuffs. But today, his usual smile was strained. "There's talk, miss," he said awkwardly, as he handed her the envelope. "About that woman in the lodge. They say she kept dried mushrooms in her cupboard. Strange ones." Miss Marple took the letter with a mild nod. "Strange is often merely misunderstood, Peter. You'd do well to remember that. She closed the door gently and carried the envelope to her writing desk. The paper was thick and official. Inside was a reply from the St. Agnes Registry. The note was brief. Occupancy records of the Gardener's Lodge, Fernley Estate, 1940 to 1946. Craig, Lionel, conscripted 1942 to 1944, 1942 to 1946, listed as temporary occupant. Ruth C. Lowenfeld, relationship to owner, unspecified notes, record incomplete, war years. See Municipal Archives, Milchester Branch, Ref. MLG 33. A Miss Marple stared at the name. Ruth Lowenfeld. Not a name known locally, not one that had been on anyone's lips, yet clearly tied to the property and to Lionel Craig, a temporary resident during the war. And what's more, the dates of Ruth's stay coincided with Lionel's absence during military service. Had he known her before, or had she come to Fernley Cross after he was called away? And why had he kept her name secret all these years? More importantly, had she returned? That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Reverend Biddle and his niece, Clara, in the vicarage garden. As they discussed the annual flower show and the shortage of good preserves this season, Miss Marple gently guided the conversation toward the subject of long-standing residents. "Do you know," she said, as she stirred her tea, "I came across a curious name in the old property records this morning. Ruth Lowenfeld. It struck me as rather poetic, didn't it? She apparently lived in the lodge during the war." Clara looked up thoughtfully. "Lowenfeld, that does ring a bell. Wasn't there a story about a woman who taught nature classes to evacuee children? I remember something from the church ledger." Reverend Biddle nodded slowly. Yes, that was years ago, of course. Taught the children in the meadow behind the schoolhouse. Kept a journal, I believe. Bit of a recluse, though. Left just after the war ended, Clara added. I think she was Austrian or Swiss. Something foreign. Wore long skirts and spoke softly. The children liked her, though some of the mothers didn't. Miss Marple tucked the information away with a quiet smile. I do hope she keeps her journals. Nature observers often notice more than just flora and fauna. That evening, as she returned home through the shaded path near the lych gate, something caught her eye. Just beyond the church hedge, nestled against the old stone wall, was a rusted watering can. Quite ordinary at first glance, no one noticed the fresh indentation in the grass beside it, as if someone had recently set it down in haste. Miss Marple approached carefully. Inside the can was nothing but damp earth, but nearby, partly buried under leaves, was a small scrap of fabric. She lifted it gently. Pale linen, frayed edge, with faded embroidery, a single letterer. She took it home in silence and placed it next to the tin box from the garden. The embroidered scrap was old, hand-stitched with the kind of careful effort one associated with a woman of modest means but neat habits. Perhaps a handkerchief, or part of a pocket lining. More curious still was the scent. Faint but distinct rosemary, and something else, something bitter. The next morning, Miss Marple did what she had been quietly planning. She returned to Manor, not through the front, but the side gate, where the vegetable plots began and the compost bins lined the back hedge. She had been watching the grounds from her bedroom window for 2 days, noting the subtle comings and goings that escaped most eyes. It was not Delilah Bray who interested her today, nor Edward Everley, who had since gone back to London. No, it was Mrs. Dunsley the cook. People rarely paid attention to cooks unless they burned something, but Miss Marple remembered distinctly how Mrs. Dunsley had appeared from behind the greenhouse just minutes after Craig collapsed, carrying a basket of herbs and a look of studied innocence. Miss Marple approached the back kitchen door just as Mrs. Dunsley was removing her apron. "Good morning," she said gently. "I was passing by and wondered if you might spare a moment. I've been having a devil of a time with my garden. Mint always seems to bolt too early." Mrs. Dunsley, flushed and startled, gave a thin smile. "Oh well, yes. Mint can be temperamental in the shade. Come round the side. I'll show you what we've got near the cook's patch." They walked past the herb garden. The rosemary was thick and aromatic, the thyme well tended, and most notably the nightshade trimmed back but not uprooted. Miss Marple knelt near it. "You do know what this is, don't you?" "Of course," the cook replied, a bit stiffly. "We never use it. But it's always been here. Lionel said it kept rabbits away." "And was it he who tended this patch?" Miss Marple asked casually. Mrs. Dunsley hesitated. "Well, yes. Mostly he was very particular about the herbs. But you did gather some yourself." "I did, for the tea blend. Mrs. Everleigh likes fresh rosemary with lavender." Miss Marple rose slowly. "I dare say, and Lionel Craig, did he know about the blend, I suppose?" "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "No reason. Only, it's remarkable how such a strong scent can mask other things entirely. Wouldn't you agree?" The cook's expression faltered, just for a moment. "You think something was added to it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did I say that?" That evening, Miss Marple returned home with a sprig of rosemary, which she placed beside the pressed nightshade on her mantel. Beneath them both sat the hand-stitched scrap of linen. A puzzle was taking shape, faint half-formed, but undeniable. Lionel Craig had known Ruth Lowenfeld. Perhaps he had loved her, or perhaps he had only protected her. In either case, she had lived quietly, left quietly, and left behind traces someone wanted erased. And now, someone else in the village, someone who moved through kitchens or gardens or the shaded paths, was attempting to rewrite that history with careful hands and poisoned cups. The clue, it seemed, had been not in what was added, but what had remained, one bitter note buried under a bouquet of sweeter herbs. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She had the outline of the truth now. What she needed was the missing corner of the tapestry, and for that she would wait, quietly, patiently, as only Miss Marple could. The days that followed Mr. Craig's mysterious death unfolded with a strange rhythm, infernally cross-gossipy, uneasy, yet touched by the ordinary rituals of village life. The tea shop still opened at 8:30. The bells at St. Luke's still rang at noon. But a current ran beneath it all, like the slow turn of dark water under a still pond. Miss Marple, never one to push openly, let the village breathe a little. She visited no fewer than 4 neighbors in 2 days, bringing jam to one, and borrowed embroidery patterns from another. She said little about the case, but observed much. And on the 4th afternoon, after the death, an unceasing rainstorm forced all into the parish hall, earlier than expected, for the monthly meeting of the Village Improvement Society. The topic was supposedly drainage along the cricket green. But as with all such gatherings, the real discussions took place in the side conversations, before and after. Miss Marple arrived promptly, took her usual chair near the middle, and unfolded her notebook. She greeted each member with polite warmth, but her attention was clearly drawn to 2 individuals seated at opposite ends of the room. Delilah Bray, seated near the windows, calm and composed as ever, and Mrs. Dunsley, red-faced, dabbing her neck with a handkerchief, her hands fidgeting in her lap. As the meeting droned on about culverts and run-off channels, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly behind her composed face. The clue wasn't merely about who had access to night, was about motive, emotion, and fear. And the letter with its allusion to Ruth, had cracked something open. After the meeting adjourned, Miss Marple didn't go home. She turned instead to Delilah, who was quietly folding a damp shawl near the coat rack. "My dear," she said, gently, "may I impose upon you for a short walk under my umbrella? There's something I'd very much like to ask you." Delilah raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple." They walked slowly down the lane, the umbrella shielding them from the drizzle. The hedgerows were beaded with rain, the air thick with the scent of soaked soil and damp moss. "I came across a name in the old records," Miss Marple said. "Ruth Lowenfeld, a woman who lived in the gardener's lodge during the war. She seems to have known Lionel Craig rather well." Delilah was silent for a moment, then said, "That name does mean something to me." Miss Marple looked over gently. "You knew her?" "No," Delilah said, "but my mother did." They stopped walking. "My mother," she continued, "was Ruth Lowenfeld." Miss Marple gave a small nod, as though this had only just confirmed a private suspicion. "And you came here to find something she left behind?" Delilah's voice was calm, but tinged with something deeper now. She used to speak of Fernley Manor in fragments, never clearly. Just mentions of a garden she loved, and a man who kept her safe when others wouldn't. She was a refugee, Miss Marple. Fled Austria in 1939, spoke little English when she arrived. The Everleys took her in out of obligation, I think, or perhaps Lionel convinced them. She stayed hidden in the lodge for years. When the war ended, she left, but she never forgot. "Did she tell you about a letter?" Miss Marple asked. Delilah hesitated, then reached into her coat. "I found this after she died." She handed over a folded parchment, slightly yellowed with age. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The same handwriting as the letter found in the tin. At the bottom, for Delilah, "Trust only the gardener. The others cannot be sure." "She was ill," Delilah said. "She died last year. I came to Fernley Cross because I had nowhere else to go, but also because I needed to know what happened, what had been left unsaid. Lionel never spoke to me. He avoided me, and then he died." Miss Marple considered her in silence. "He may have avoided you because he feared what your presence would stir up. Secrets, my dear, are like compost piles. They may seem harmless when untouched, but disturb them, and the scent is undeniable." Back at the cottage, Miss Marple made a quiet note in her journal. "Delilah Bray is not a killer. She is the key." That same evening, Miss Marple paid another visit, this time not with politeness, but with quiet intent. Mrs. Dunsley answered the door of the back kitchen with her apron still on and flour on her sleeves. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting." "I don't expect you were," Miss Marple said calmly. "But I believe it's time we had a little talk, you and I." The cook looked ready to protest, but something in Miss Marple's gaze halted her. "I found the scrap of linen you dropped behind the greenhouse," Miss Marple said. "Embroidered very delicately, with an R. I suppose it once belonged to Ruth Lowenfeld." Mrs. Dunsley paled. "I also know," Miss Marple continued, "that Lionel Craig didn't die simply from old age. Something had been added to his tea blend, a herb that, in the right amount, would weaken the heart. He'd grown wary, hadn't he? Begun to suspect he was being watched, followed. "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Dunsley said quietly, dropping into a chair. "No," said Miss Marple, "but you know who did." The woman's eyes filled, and for a moment the kitchen was silent but for the ticking of the wall clock. "It was Edward," she said at last. "Mr. Everleigh's son. He came to the kitchen the night before the party, looking through the old cupboards, asking about the gardener's routines. He'd argued with Lionel, I think, something about property, about what had been buried. He asked me to prepare the tea blend for the greenhouse table. Said it was a special touch. I didn't think anything of it until later." Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "And when Lionel died, you realized something had been done?" Mrs. Dunsley nodded. "But I was afraid. I've worked for the Everleys for over 30 years. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes loyalty to the living blinds us to the justice owed to the dead." That night, Miss Marple wrote a final note in her journal before bed. Edward Everley feared the truth would come out. Ruth's return through her daughter was enough to drive him to desperate action. But Lionel had already taken precautions. He left the map, the tin, the warning. He knew his enemy, and still the full story was not yet complete. There was one piece left to reveal, one confrontation still to come. Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Tomorrow she would invite Edward Everley to tea. The Everleys had always kept their affairs neat, if not entirely transparent. The manor had survived 2 wars, a brief scandal involving a second cousin's will, and now, it seemed, was weathering something altogether darker. But, as Miss Marple always said, darkness, like ivy, did not announce itself. It simply crept in slowly, until it choked the walls of even the most respectable houses. The following afternoon, Edward Everley returned to Fernley Cross. He had said in his telegram to his mother that he needed to tie up a few estate matters following Lionel Craig's death. But Miss Marple knew it was not financial matters that summoned Edward now. It was the quiet, creeping scent of danger. She had arranged for tea to be served at her cottage, laid out simply in her garden beneath the climbing clematis, with lemon, biscuits, and Earl Grey in her grandmother's china. Her invitation had been sent that morning courteously, and with just enough intrigue to make refusal difficult. Edward arrived 10 minutes early. He was, as ever, neatly dressed, but his collar sat unevenly against his neck, and there was a tension in his jaw that betrayed more than polite fatigue. Miss Marple greeted him with her usual warmth and gestured for him to sit. "Such a comfort to take tea out of doors," she said lightly, pouring it for both of them. "It gives one a sense of detachment from the indoor world, and perhaps clarity." Edward smiled, though it was thin and strained. "I hear the village has been busy." "Well," Miss Marple replied gently, "minds do tend to stir when something unexpected occurs, especially when a trusted man dies at his own farewell party. So theatrical, don't you think?" He stiffened slightly. "You suspect it wasn't natural?" "I don't suspect, I observe." She paused, letting the moment stretch just long enough. "For instance," she continued, "I observed that Lionel Craig was not a man inclined to sudden collapses. He was measured, precise, a man who would rather prune a hedge than stir a scene. And yet, just before he fell, he looked at the greenhouse not in confusion, but in dread. Edward said nothing. His teacup remained untouched, and I observed," Miss Marple added softly, "that shortly before Lionel's death, someone had asked Mrs. Dunsley to prepare a special herbal blend for the party, with rosemary, lavender, and something else, perhaps." His eyes met hers. "Sharp now, you're making quite the implication." "No," she said. "I'm simply laying out facts and asking a question." He exhaled sharply, the veneer cracking. He was going to give her the lodge. Miss Marple didn't speak, but her eyes encouraged him to go on. "I saw them speaking once years ago. My father didn't know, mother didn't know, but I did. Lionel and Ruth, they had something. I never understood what, but it changed him. And then she disappeared, and you believed he was going to pass something down to her daughter," Miss Marple said gently. Edward looked out across the garden, avoiding her gaze. "That property, it's worth more now, and not just in land. There are rumors of documents buried there. Lionel knew things about my grandfather, about the war, about certain sales of valuables. I didn't want complications. So you silenced him? No, he said quickly. I meant only to search. I confronted him. Yes, pressed him, but he refused. Said the garden kept what it was meant to keep. That I'd never understand. Miss Marple tilted her head. And so you thought to make him unburden himself with pressure, or fear? Edward's hand trembled as he reached for the cup. I didn't poison him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I lost my temper. I threatened to contest his rights to the property. But I left that night. I didn't touch his tea. But you knew about the herbs. You'd asked Mrs. Dunsley to make the blend. You set the wheels in motion. I didn't think he stopped himself. It was supposed to be symbolic, a gesture. I didn't know he had a weak heart. Miss Marple studied him. He didn't. That's the interesting part. Dr. Lowell found nothing to suggest natural cardiac issues, but there were traces of something else. Something that reacts only in the presence of certain herbs. Something very old-fashioned, like dried monkshood, or concentrated extract of foxglove, both of which grow wild in Fernley Gardens, if one knows where to look. Edward paled. You think I? He broke off. Then who? I believe, Miss Marple said, someone else wanted. Lionel Craig silenced. Someone who feared what he might pass on, not just land, but truth. He stood abruptly. You're not going to the police. I already have. But only with what I know, not with what I believe. That, Mr. Everleigh, rests still in the soil. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting. The encounter had not produced a confession, but it had confirmed. Much Edward Everleigh had secrets, yes. But he lacked the cold calculation necessary for poisoning a man in front of an audience. His guilt was born of inheritance, not malice. That evening, just after twilight, a second twist arrived. Sergeant Weatherby knocked at her door with a curious expression. In his hand, he held a tarnished silver brooch wrapped in cloth. This was turned in by one of the groundskeepers at Fernley, he said. Found near the base of the rhododendrons behind the greenhouse. Looks old. Valuable. Miss Marple examined it. The brooch was delicately engraved with a thistle, and initials are C.L. Ruth C. Lowenfeld, she murmured. Weatherby nodded. Thing is, the groundskeeper says it wasn't there earlier this week. He swears someone placed it recently. A message, Miss Marple said softly, or a warning. She turned the brooch over. A small clasp on the back had broken, but beneath it, embedded in the frame, was something else. A slip of paper. Rolled tightly, she eased it free. The message was short. The truth is buried, but not lost. They fear what lies beneath the lily bed. Weatherby looked up. You think there's something buried? I think, said Miss Marple, rising with surprising briskness, that we shall pay a visit to Fernley Manor, tonight, because the final act had already begun, and the soil of Fernley Cross, like its secrets, was about to yield something, long concealed. Twilight lingered longer than usual over Fernley Cross, casting a bruised mauve across the horizon and deepening the shadows under every hedge and tree. By the time Miss Marple and Sergeant Weatherby reached the iron gate of Fernley Manor, the village was hushed. The only sound, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, and the faint rustling of evening birds. Mrs. Everleigh met them at the door in her dressing gown, her greying hair coiled into a tidy bun, and her expression somewhere between alarm and confusion. "Jane," she asked, clutching the fabric at her neck, "what on earth brings you here at this hour?" Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude, Rosalind, but I believe something of value may be hidden on your grounds. Something that might help us understand poor Lionel's last days." We were hoping to examine the lily bed. The lily bed? Rosalind blinked. Surely not at night. I'm afraid time may be of the essence, said Weatherby gently. We won't dig anything up without your consent, but we'd appreciate your cooperation. After a moment's pause, and a glance at Miss Marple, who simply tilted her head in that quiet, persuasive way she had, Rosalind gave a terse nod and stepped aside. The trio crossed the back lawn, past the rosewalk, and toward the circular pond where white lilies floated serenely beneath the moonlight. Beyond it, in a patch of well-tended soil flanked by hedges, the lily bed lay still and fragrant. It had always been Lionel Craig's Preda blend of elegance and symmetry, arranged with obsessive precision. But, as they approached, Miss Marple stopped suddenly. Someone was already there. Delilah Bray stood by the edge of the flower bed, her back half turned to them, holding what looked like a small hand spade. She was pale, and her shoulders stiffened when she heard them. "Miss Bray," said Weatherby, surprised, "we weren't expecting anyone here." Delilah turned slowly. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I've been thinking about what my mother might have left behind. I thought perhaps this was the place." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes not unkind. "You were drawn to it, were you? The lilies, or what Lionel may have buried beneath them?" Delilah lowered her gaze. "I didn't come to steal anything, if that's what you think." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but I think someone else did, or tried to." Weatherby knelt down beside the lilies and gently pushed aside a cluster of soil. Beneath the first few inches, his fingers struck something solid. He uncovered a narrow, rusted tin older than the first, its seal barely holding. With effort, he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound book and a sealed envelope, bearing a single word, Ruth. The book was a gardener's log, written in Lionel Craig's hand. Miss Marple opened the first page and read aloud. October 1945. The war is over, but peace does not come easily. Ruth left this morning. She told me not to wait. But I cannot let go of what we buried here, her letters, the ledger, the names. If someone should return for them, let it be one who understands plants and pain. There was silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Weatherby turned to Delilah. "You knew something like this might be here." She shook her head. "I suspected, but I didn't know for certain." Miss Marple closed the book gently. "Then we must see what else this little book tells us." They returned to the manor study. Mrs. Everleigh, now fully dressed, brought in tea despite the hour and sat near the window in silence, listening. Miss Marple read the entries, one by one. Some were mundane planting times, weather notes, but others revealed something deeper. Lionel had kept records not just of the garden, but of secrets whispered to him in confidence. He had noted meetings during the war. Goods moved quietly through the village. Names of those who helped refugees, and most troublingly those who had profited from their desperation. "Here," Miss Marple said, pointing to a short entry, dated 1944. "E.E. arrived after dusk. Demanded I dig up the ledger. Refused. Told him the soil keeps better company than thieves." "E.E.," murmured Weatherby. "Edward Everleigh." Rosalind gasped. "That's nonsense. Edward was just a boy during the war." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "Too young to be the E.E. mentioned here." A sudden stillness fell across the room. Then Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Everleigh. "Rosalind," she said kindly, "what did your husband do during the war?" Mrs. Everleigh looked startled. "Henry, he served in the Admiralty, clerical work." "Nothing dangerous?" "Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked. "Because I suspect that someone using the initials E.E. approached Lionel in 1944, trying to retrieve certain records." records which, if made public, might have tarnished Fernley Manor's legacy. Rosalind's lips parted slightly, her eyes distant now. "There was a time," she said quietly, "when Henry spent late nights in his study, receiving letters he never explained. I asked once, he told me it was estate matters. I believed him." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, and Lionel Craig knew the truth. He buried those records, protected Ruth, protected her legacy. And when Edward your son began to poke around again, Lionel must have feared history repeating itself. "But, my son," Rosalind turned sharply. "You don't think Edward, no?" said Miss Marple, "not the poisoner?" But he stirred up a fear long buried. And someone else, someone who still remembered what Lionel knew, took the opportunity to act. Weatherby looked up. "Then we're still missing the hand that mixed the herbs." Miss Marple rose, her eyes fixed on the hearth. "Lionel once wrote, 'The one who knows the plants may be the last to see it right.' He was speaking of Ruth. But who else, in Fernley, knows the plants?" They all turned slowly to Delilah, but she looked just as puzzled. And then Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Everleigh. "You, Rosalind, you've kept these gardens alive since your husband died. You've instructed the cook. You hosted the party. And you, too, feared what Lionel might reveal." Rosalind stood up slowly, shaking her head. "No, no, I never." "You didn't mean to kill him," Miss Marple said gently. "You meant only to weaken him, perhaps delay him. You were trying to protect Edward from disgrace, from scandal." Rosalind stared at her, then slowly sank back into her chair. "I only wanted time," she whispered. "Time to persuade him not to say anything. He'd threatened to show Delilah the documents, said she deserved the truth. And so," said Miss Marple, "you brewed a tea that would keep him quiet, just for a few days. But the dose was stronger than you realized, and Lionel's heart, while not weak, was not as strong as it once was." Weatherby remained still for a moment, then reached for his notebook. "I'll need a statement," he said softly. "We'll take it gently, Mrs. Everleigh." But Rosalind didn't speak. She simply looked at the garden beyond the window, at the lilies glowing faintly in the moonlight, and the long shadow they cast over everything once buried, and Miss Marple, quiet as ever, poured herself another cup of tea. Because there was still one piece left, one envelope, still sealed, addressed to Ruth, and Delilah, seated now beside the fire, would be the one to open it. The rain returned to Fernley Cross the next morning, soft and insistent, beading on rose petals and washing over the stone walls of the manor like a slow penance. Miss Marple awoke early, not to the birdsong she usually enjoyed, but to the hush of drizzle and the memory of the night before. The sealed envelope remained unopened through the first pot of tea. Delilah Bray had taken it with trembling fingers but had not read it in front of them. Instead, she had slipped it carefully into her coat pocket, nodding at Miss Marple with a look of quiet reverence. Now, as the village stirred slowly, unaware that its long-held secrets were breathing their last, Miss Marple prepared herself for one final visit to the manor. There were still truths to be spoken aloud, truths that needed their moment in daylight. At precisely 10 o'clock, she returned to Fernley Manor. The parlour had been made modestly presentable, despite the grim events of the evening before. A fire crackled gently in the hearth. Tea had been laid out, untouched. Rosalind Everleigh was not present. She had left early that morning with Sergeant Weatherby to give a full account of her actions. No formal arrest had been made yet, and Miss Marple suspected there never would be. The police in such villages often understood the difference between justice and punishment. Delilah sat quietly in the corner, the envelope now opened and lying beside her on the tea table. Her eyes were pink-rimmed, not from grief alone, but from some deeper emotion, recognition, perhaps, or closure. Miss Marple took the chair opposite her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The sound of rain on the windows filled the space between them like a kind of truth in itself. "She loved him," Delilah said at last, her voice thin but steady. "More than I ever knew. More than she ever allowed herself to speak." Miss Marple nodded. "And he her, I believe." Delilah picked up the letter, unfolded it slowly. It's dated 1946, just before she left Fernley Cross. She read aloud, "Lionel, my dearest, the war has ended, but it has taken something from us that peace cannot return. I cannot stay. Your world has no place for a woman like me, not now, not openly, but I leave behind what we planted both in the soil and in the silence. I trust you to tend both. If my daughter returns here one day, tell her only what she needs to know. She will understand the rest. Forever yours, R." Delilah folded the letter again with a sigh. "She never told me about him. Not really. Just fragments. A name. A garden. I thought it was imagination." "It often is, until it isn't," Miss Marple said gently. Delilah reached into her satchel and retrieved the gardener's log. "This ledger Lionel kept, it's more than a garden diary. It's a record of this village during a time no one likes to talk about. He wrote about Mr. Everleigh's dealings, how certain heirlooms were sold under the guise of war donations, but in truth were acquired from desperate refugees." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "He kept that secret for decades, even as it haunted him, not because he wanted revenge, but because he needed someone to remember it rightly." Delilah nodded, and to pass it on, they sat in silence, letting the weight of the years settle round them. Miss Marple studied the fire, its orange glow flickering against the silver tea tray. "I suppose," Delilah said slowly, "that I could leave now. There's nothing to stay for, not really. No family." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled, not unkindly. "That's where I must disagree with you, my dear. You have a great deal here. Not only what Ruth left you, but what you've now uncovered. Lionel didn't bury those truths out of shame. He buried them to protect them, like bulbs before a frost. And now they've bloomed." Delilah looked down at the logbook. "Do you think the village will want to hear any of it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The village, like most things English, is selective about what it listens to. But whether or not it's heard, truth has a way of lingering, like time in old mortar." Delilah returned the smile, more genuine now. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. I've merely lived long enough to see that evil is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, subtle, it wears respectability like a cloak. But so does goodness, you know. You only need to know where to look." As the clock chimed 11, a tap came at the front door. A constable stood there briefly to inform them that Rosalind Everleigh had given a signed statement. No charges would be pursued. The death would be ruled as accidental, owing to a mixture of natural frailty and misjudged herbal dosing. Discreet, tidy, as Fernley Cross preferred. After he left, Miss Marple stood and gathered her gloves. "I think," she said, "you should keep the ledger. It's not for me to decide what to do with it. But I rather imagine your mother meant it to be yours." Delilah clutched the book against her chest. "I'll read it slowly, and I'll decide then." They walked together down the gravel path, beneath the heavy boughs of dripping trees. The lily bed, now cordoned with twine and flagged with constable markers, glistened in the rain. The flowers, untouched by all the disturbance, swayed gently. In the wind, Miss Marple paused, looking at them. "It's strange," she said. "In a garden, what grows above tells you little about what lies beneath. The healthiest flowers may draw life from roots buried in sorrow. Delilah turned to her. Do you think she ever regretted leaving? Of course, Miss Marple said quietly. But Ruth was wise. She knew not every story ends with reconciliation. Some end with understanding. And that can be enough. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting by the fire. The quiet rhythm of needles a familiar comfort. Her mind lingered on Lionel Craiger, silent gardener who had protected love and truth with soil and silence. And on Ruth, who had trusted that someday her daughter would return to find both. There was one last note in her notebook, the dead whisper when no one else dares speak. But sometimes, if you listen closely enough, their voices plant the seed of what comes next. Miss Marple looked out the window toward the distant churchyard. The rain had lightened. The lilies, no longer merely decorative, now stood as silent sentinels over the truths they once concealed. And as the bells of St. Luke began to chime at noon, Miss Marple reached for a fresh skein of yarn and smiled softly to herself. The past had spoken, and at last someone had truly listened. The rains passed by the end of the week, leaving cross-soaked but glistening, as if the village itself had been rinsed clean. Morning light touched the thatched rooftops with a soft golden hue, and the hedgerows, saturated and heavy, released a fresh scent into the air of mint, and something older beneath it all. Life resumed with a familiar rhythm. The bakery reopened with its Friday jam tart special. Mrs. Bantry could be seen trimming her roses in a new straw hat, purchased with a stern face and a half-spoken apology to Miss Marple for having doubted. That poor Delilah girl, the vicar's niece, Clara, took down the extra prayer candles from the front pew, declaring the spiritual atmosphere less fraught, and gossip, which had spun like a wild vine for days, now returned to gentler terrain curtains at the hall. The butcher's daughter's curious new companion. And whether or not the vicar had been wearing mismatched socks at Sunday service, only the greenhouse at Fernley Manor remained quiet, its door now sealed and the lilies beyond it undisturbed. Miss Marple, for her part, did not speak further of Lionel Craig, nor of Ruth, nor of the quiet poison that had nearly slipped past an entire village. She moved on to her next pair of mittens, wrote a short note to her nephew Raymond in London, and resumed tending her own garden, which had grown a bit unruly in recent weeks. But some matters were not so easily tidied. One of them was Delilah Bray. She remained in Fernley Cross, for now, not as a guest, nor as a stranger. She had taken up temporary residence in the gardener's lodge, with the blessing of Mrs. Everleigh, whose name, for the first time in memory, had become one not spoken with universal admiration, but with a soft note of pity and caution. Rosalind had not left the village. In fact, she seemed determined to carry on her duties, appearing at the Altar Guild meeting that Monday, with fresh lilies from the estate and an expression that suggested neither apology nor defiance, but something somewhere in between, a kind of wearied grace. Delilah had not yet decided what to do with the gardener's log. It remained safely locked in a small chest beneath the bed, read nightly, one entry at a time. She had shown a few pages to Miss Marple, just enough to confirm that Lionel Craig had known far more about the Everleigh family and about Fernley Cross than anyone had ever guessed. But the question of what should be made public, and what ought to rest with the dead, remained unsettled. One afternoon, a week after the funeral, Delilah arrived at Miss Marple's cottage unannounced, holding a bundle of lilies wrapped in paper. "I thought your window looked a bit bare," she said simply. Miss Marple ushered her in, took the lilies, and placed them in a tall vase beside the bookcase. "I suppose you've been thinking," Miss Marple said gently, "about what to do with all that truth you now hold." Delilah sat, her hands still slightly stained with soil. "It's a strange thing. I came here searching for something lost, but what I found, it's not just mine. It belongs to the place, to the memory of people who can no longer speak for themselves." Miss Marple poured 2 cups of tea and stirred hers slowly. "That's often the burden of those who inherit truth. It can't always be shouted. Sometimes it must be folded into quiet changes." Delilah looked down at her cup. "I've been writing to a publisher. Nothing dramatic, just a small collection. About gardens and silence. I don't name the village or the people, but the stories are there. If someone chooses to read between the lines." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Very wise and very kind." Outside, children's voices rang through the lane, laughter trailing behind. A bouncing ball. A postman cycled past, waving. The world, as always, moved forward. "There's one more thing," Delilah said, reaching into her coat. She pulled out the pressed nightshade flower Miss Marple had once placed on her mantel. "I thought you might want this back." Miss Marple took it with a thoughtful look. "No, my dear, I believe it belongs to you now. A reminder that even the most poisonous things may carry meaning, but best kept flat and dried and no longer growing." Delilah smiled. "That's how I feel about the past, too." Later, after Delilah had gone, Miss Marple sat alone, gazing out the window as dusk painted the garden in gold and lavender. She thought of Lionel Craig's steady hands, of Ruth's quiet courage, of Rosalind's tragic miscalculation, and of the secrets, buried not just in soil but in silence. People often believed that evil was loud, that it came with violence or rage. But in her experience, it was far more likely to come dressed in propriety, cloaked in good intentions, or hidden in forgotten corners of a greenhouse. What Lionel had done was not heroic in a grand way, but it was good. Quietly, stubbornly good. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the kind of legacy worth tending. As the clock chimed 7, she lit the lamp beside her chair and picked up her knitting. Outside, the first stars began to appear above the rooftops of Fernley Cross. The lilies in the vase swayed slightly in the breeze through the open window, their white petals soft against the darkening sky. And in the stillness that followed, Miss Marple smiled. The garden would bloom again, and so would the truth.